grow citrus fruits, and maybe a nut, like a walnut. Okay. And then it was tradition from that day on, at night, you put your shoes that you wore outside your bedroom. And yeah, if you'd been a good girl, or boy, you did this all the way through Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, you would have something in your shoes, like a cookie or nothing extravagant or too much. And if you had disobeyed, for whatever reason, the shoes were empty. So I just thought I'd throw that out. It was a nice custom. I did it with my children. Okay, so here we are about World War II. I was born in the year of 1939. And you all know that's the year that the war started. I was born in June, and Hitler's army marched into Poland with his Blitzkrieg, which was sort of a lightning war, and he really took it fast, right at the beginning of September. So, you know, I was just a tiny baby. I didn't know anything. I was born in the city of Eisenach. It's spelled E-I-S-E-N-A-C-H, and it's in the province of Thuringia. The city is not huge, but it has a lot of history. It has a castle called the Wartburg, spelled W-A-R-T-B-U-R-G. And as a matter of fact, Martin Luther had a protector because, you know, there was a lot of commotion with him declaring a lot of things wrong with the Catholic Church. But he did translate the Bible at that castle from Latin to German. And he was under the protectorate of whoever the Duke or whoever, you know, was in charge then. It was usually some big guy. So, does it have any other history? Well, those two things. And I lived about one block over. There was the Johann Sebastian Bach house where the family lived at one time. Okay, so that's enough history. I lived there till I was 3.5, which would make it 1, 2, 3.5, born in June. In January, we moved. And I was devastated. You know, children don't like to move all the time, but we did. And I found out later, my father, who was 40 when I was born, had been in World War I. And he saw this war going to come from bombs from the air. And he said, we're not as safe here as in a much smaller town. So we moved to a much smaller town, about, I forgot, not many inhabitants, but it was a little tourist town. And he owned a small hotel and restaurant. And we stayed there till we left the town in January 49. So I spent 6 years there, because I was 9 when we left, 9.5, got there when I was 3.5. Actually, I think my parents tried to make my life, and I had a little brother later on, as normal as possible. I really had a pretty good childhood, which might sound amazing to you, because, you know, we were away from big cities, they were not Hitler sympathizers, so it was a tourist town. Nobody wanted to really bomb us. However, the air raids did start. You know, we had an air raid often. And the town was so small that we as a family would go into the woods because it was surrounded by woods and hills. And winter and summer. You know, I remember my mother in the winter pushing my little baby brother in a carriage through the snow. I guess the older I got, I knew that this wasn't a good thing, especially being pulled out of bed late at night, but middle of the night. And my father always stayed behind, which was the common thing. I thought later in life, what would he have done if a bomb had fallen? He couldn't have upheld the building, but that's what he did. So that was not, I realized that this was something that could come from above that wouldn't be too good. But you forget about it as a child. I mean, you don't delve on that. So life went on, and really it was about 1944. It was, no. Yeah, it was early 44. They didn't arrest my father, it being a small town, but they called him in for questioning. And like I said, he was probably not drafted in the German army because he had been in World War I. They didn't like something. He was fairly successful with his business. So instead of saying Heil Hitler, which I never saw him do, but in a public building, in a business, you had to raise your hand or arm and say Heil Hitler. Well, my father didn't. He got away with this for many years. He would say good evening, good afternoon, whatever. And someone complained about it. So there was sort of an administration. We were in a tiny square across the street from us, and it was winter, for about 2-3 days he had to go there. And they would question him. I don't know what they asked him anymore, or did I know then. But I knew it was serious. A child can tell just by the way, the atmosphere is, and your parents are tense. I didn't like it, and my mother would peep from behind the curtains because we were right across. But he came back, and believe it or not, I think the reason he was not arrested and we weren't sent to, God forbid, a concentration camp is because someone who was a party member was a fairly good friend of. He was a good friend of my father's, and he put in a good word for him. So, this was 44. You'd think they'd have other things to worry about. The war ended in May of 45, but, it's crazy. So, what happened next? Well, I absorbed the tension somewhat because my parents knew they were the best parents, but they knew nothing about child psychology. So they would talk in front of me. One thing that stands out in my memory is you couldn't say, that you were against the regime. That's how it is under socialism. And we had a lot of help in the hotel. A few lived in the hotel. So if you wanted the real news, because the Nazi news under Goebbels was all propaganda. We were always winning the war when we really weren't. So if you wanted to know anything, in our living room we had a radio. She would sit, because anybody could report you. She would sit with her ear glued to the radio, and you got the real news. We were losing all over the place. They won a few battles. The war was terrible, and from then on, 44 on for sure, maybe before my father said, there's no way they're going to win that war. Russia, it was insane to go into Russia. Nobody goes into Russia and wins a war like they used to fight a war. Napoleon didn't. He had to retreat, and the Germans got stuck in there, and they lost a big division there. They starved to death. I think it's Stalingrad. Well, and then 45 rolled around. That's when the war came home. And we were lucky where we were living. My father did a good thing moving us where he did. So it was in April. seem to think it was around the 10th for some reason. I always remember that. That it was actually Patton's army came through our area. And before we all retired, we could hear the bombing of the next big city, just boom, boom. So we didn't sleep in our beds. My father had reinforced the cellar. And there were quite a few people down there, like an old couple who were guests who didn't want to go back home to their city. They wanted to be where it was a little safer. So the whole family, some help, we all went down there, and we spent the whole night. Of course, they did come through. We were not bombed. It was mainly artillery fire. And of course, a lot of tanks that we heard rolling. And they did shoot at buildings. Our building, which was about 3 stories high, was shot at. Because, they were always suspecting that there were some stragglers around who would fight them. So all of a sudden, the next morning, I think it was daylight, everything got quiet as a mouse. And I remember that night, my father saying, just in general, we're safe down here. What cellars are like, they're terrible. There was the basement. They stored vegetables down there. They had a big oven to heat the building, but we weren't in that section. The windows were high. And my father said, we are safe here, unless the building, gets so much damage and stones come down that everything over there was built with stones that you can't get out those windows anywhere. And he said the next big danger, I don't know why he told everybody that would be if there was a gas leak, God forbid. But that didn't happen. So it was very quiet, and after a little while, we heard the piano playing in one of the dining rooms. And my father said, well, I better go upstairs and see what's going on. And somebody yelled at him, wave a white handkerchief, so they don't shoot you. Of course, at that age, and I was just getting close to being 6 years old, you understand that there's a big danger. You can't put it all together, but you do understand. And, we waited anxiously. And then after a while, he came back down. Now, I don't know how they conversed. My father did not know English. Most of the Americans didn't know a word of German, but they let him know that we had to get out of the building. We lived in the building. It was our home. We lived there those 6 years. Had I been in my bed, my regular bed, which was sort of a youth bed, I would have probably been dead because there was machine gun fire all through the headboard and what was at the bottom. So they might have gotten me. But they didn't, because I was way down under the building. Okay, so we had to get out. I mean, what they were going to do, believe it or not, it was Patton's army, by the way. They were going to, we figured out, they set up headquarters there because the place had a huge backyard. And they set up headquarters, and of course, we were the enemy, right? So they said, get out. It was not really, what we wanted to do. Now, in the building itself, all the windows had come out of the building, and they had concrete balconies facing the front of the building. Some of those the stones lay on the terrace. I mean, it had some damage, but you could live there. So we had to go. So my parents always had, not a little red wagon, but a little wooden wagon ready that you pulled with some suitcases on there. And my mother, when she came upstairs, my brother was only 10 months old, I think. She made a big deal with this American soldier. She had to go in the kitchen and get some baby bottles. And of course he didn't know what she was saying. I don't know if he ever figured it out. But she finally got some baby bottles. And we went out the back. And when we went out the back, my grandmother was with us. I think actually that's the first time in my life that something just came over me, like a really sickening, bad feeling. You know, up till then, like I said, my parents provided us with a fairly good childhood, and it was a very beautiful little town. So, you know, I almost sometimes didn't know there was a war. Okay, so we left. It was a terrible feeling. It's the first time I felt truly, truly sad in my life. So then we went around the long block because they had some friends at the other end who owned the cafe, and they were going to take us in, but then they decided to come back. We crossed in the front of our building. There was a side street, and right next door was a small grocery and sort of a semi-farmer, and they took us in. So we could see everything that was going on. The Americans set up little houses in that backyard. They had at least 3, looked like little huts for communications and what have you. So we were out. Now, the remarkable thing is, believe it or not, and I'm telling it to you like it was, like I remember it, the Americans were rather nice. I can't say that they weren't. The funny thing is, nobody told me I couldn't go play outside. Oh, that first night I was scared because the people didn't have that much room. So we ended up being in what they used as storerooms, but you went up on the outside, sort of like a motel, which you don't have much in Germany at that time, and then you went into a door. Okay, so my mother put my brother and I, and he was no comfort to me at his age, into this room and proceeded to lock the door from the outside. And I screamed and hollered, and I said, "Don't leave us here." You know, of course that was to no avail. She did. And I cried myself to sleep, and I could hear the tanks moving and all that commotion. And I said, my God, what if something happens to my parents? You know, that was my big worry. It didn't. So after that night, I think I slept better. And before I knew it, I was outside, playing outside in the street. The Americans gave us chewing gum as kids. They gave us chocolate bars. You know, we thought that was great because you didn't get much chocolate in Germany towards the end of the war. A little bit from Switzerland because it was always neutral. Yeah, so we had our chocolate. We were happy. And they were nice to us, you know. And oh my goodness, they gave my father cigarettes, which is something, he was a big smoker. You couldn't get cigarettes, or you got the substitute, which I'm sure he didn't like. So one night, it was still daylight, you know, it happened in April. We were going into spring and summer. We walked around this big old block, and I think the Americans were giving away so much chocolate and chewing gum and nylon stockings to girlfriends, you know, and of course the German young women hadn't seen a man in ages. They were all in the German army. So that they finally told them not to give all their rations away. But they couldn't just hand it to them like they had been. So we took this long walk, and all of a sudden, it was just my parents and I. My father said, Kristina, that's a, you know, it means Kristina. He said, go ahead. He said, that American is dropping cigarettes for me. That was his way of getting them to my dad. So I would pick him up, you know. Okay, so that was fine. So that went on till I think they were still had their headquarters there, but they let us back into the building, I'd say end of July. We couldn't stay in the rooms we had occupied to sleep, so we had to move to another section that had windows, but we were back home, so to speak. Of course, food was scarce, everything was scarce. And get anything here. Where am I?